I just want to start out by saying that the panel discussion today is brought to you in conjunction with the Atlanta chapter of the Revenue Collective. So for my fellow members out there, thanks for joining. Panel is also brought to you by Vertify. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Vertify, we're a leading revenue operations intelligence platform that empowers revenue teams to harness predictive intelligence that accelerates growth. During today's roundtable discussion, we're going to discuss the metrics that matter most, challenges revenue leaders often face in producing the right data, and recommendations that can make reporting easier for you. So just to do some introductions here. So I'm joined by my colleague, Lacey Miller. She is our Director of Marketing here at Vertify. I'm also joined by Jim Douglas, who's a partner with Fulcrum Equity Partners based here in Atlanta. We also have Morgan Flager, with Silverton Partners that is based in Austin, and Dave Lambert with Right Side Capital that's based in San Francisco. So let's just go ahead and jump in. I'm just gonna start with my preamble, which is the success of our business, or really any business, is due to many factors. Sometimes it takes a bit of luck, but not the least of which is the ability to report on accurate information. So I'd like to start the discussion off today by simply asking the panel to state their opinions on the importance of gathering and reporting on data that you can trust. So Lacey, why don't you kick us off?
I'm going to kick you off with my new favorite stat, and it's that only 8% of companies are housing finance, sales, and marketing data in the same single source of truth. So at the end of the day, when you're asking about data you can trust, there's so many variations to this response because it depends on how you've even set up your business and how you've set up your team. And so from the marketing side of things, I'm working as hard as I can to do that, but sometimes it makes me nervous on the data that I even have access to.
Okay, great. Dave, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, for us, the KPIs that are the most important thing for a business, and the KPIs vary by business. But as investors, that's what we're most concerned with tracking and following. So, you can see if you go to our website and click on the blog section, one of my partners has written 2 long posts about what makes a really good monthly investor update. And you'll see we very strongly encourage all companies to sort of lead all investor updates with the critical KPIs for their business and list those at the top, because ultimately those are what are most important, and those give the most insight into the health of the business.
Great. Jim, what do you think?
Yeah, they're not too dissimilar. I think we're looking for high growth B2B SaaS businesses that are metric driven, and not metrics for a board meeting, metrics that are ingrained into the everyday life of the business. So I understand my funnels. I understand how the metrics that drive my funnels. I understand my conversion rates. And it's all integrated, so it naturally comes out. We've all been in those environments where you're scrambling to try to pull this together for a board meeting. That's exactly what you don't want. You want one that your team is operating across your sales team, your marketing team, your customer success team, your product teams. They're all living their own KPIs daily and weekly. So when you get around to a board meeting, it's just kind of hit the button and it comes out of what's happened, because that's the way you run your business.
That's great. Morgan, what do you think?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that last point. I mean, the last thing that we want is, people that aren't managing to the numbers on a daily basis and then trying to kind of report them at an episodic point in time, like a board meeting or an M&A conversation or something like that. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, not having the data is like flying a plane at night without the instruments. You don't kind of wait until you land to get the flight log and path kind of downloaded to some system. You better be looking at those instruments kind of as you go along. And it's also a bit of a normalizing factor. I mean, I think, rewind, 30 years or 20 years within BC, there was a lot of kind of predisposition for folks to back really experienced leaders. And it was because there wasn't as much data and people needed to rely more on experience. Like I've seen that before, and that looks good or it doesn't look good. And now you don't, obviously experience is still beneficial, but you can look at the numbers and manage and measure things so closely. So it's definitely a normalizing factor if used correctly for younger folks that don't necessarily have, the 20 or 30 years worth of gut feel experience.
Those are some great points there. So where do revenue leaders typically struggle when it comes to reporting? And I guess I'll follow up that question by asking, do you ever have doubts about the data? So I'm going to start with you, Lacey, because you bring a unique perspective, because in many ways, many of the attendees on this discussion today are folks like you and I that really have our hands in the data. So what do you think?
I should have introduced myself and kind of my background. I'm the director of marketing at Vertify. And so the perspective that I am bringing is I'm the one talking to the board members. I'm the one presenting to my executive team. And so I understand that as a marketer, I challenge my team to really think in outcomes. Sometimes we have a campaign that fails on paper in regards to the data. We can come back together, say what was the outcome we wanted, pivot, and then make a success out of that particular piece. And so when I think about, then I have to go and report to the board, I have to balance that gut instinct. I do need that there. But then going back to, I need finance to be an integral partner of mine. I need sales to be an integral partner of mine. We should be meeting constantly to discuss how the data looks across what we're doing, but also be able to step back and look at the business health overall. And so that's why you got to bring in the data from those other teams so that we can all look at the health of the business and not just marketing focused on marketing, because I really don't succeed unless the entire company succeeds.
Good points for sure. So Jim, what about you? Where have you seen revenue leaders and your various portfolio companies struggle? Do you ever have doubts about their data?
Yeah, and honestly now, I can't say we never have it in portfolio companies because we do, but I've really moved to a mindset of, if I don't see a diligence, a company that's metric driven, and they're not going to be perfect, but it's available now. Like Morgan said earlier, if you're not doing it, I just consider it a form of laziness. It's like, I don't want to be a part of that business. And that probably comes from, I've only been in this business 7 years. I was an operator before that. It probably becomes I grew up as the one that had to gather all that data, and I know what a pain in the ass it is. And why would you do that when it's so easy to connect these things now? I want to say it's easy, but I consider that kind of table stakes and something that we're going to provide growth capital to, that they've got it metric together well enough that we can tell what we're putting capital in and what should come out of the bottom of that.
Morgan, what are you seeing on from your perspective?
Yeah, just to kind of, super directly answer the question, like what are, common areas where people struggle with, or, the data might not be reliable. Obviously within marketing, attribution is always kind of one of those things where is it last touch? Where did the journey begin? Like, how do you tie the pieces together to know what's more effective? I think that's kind of been an ongoing saga, and things are getting better and there's more data available, but that's kind of a general area where people kind of continually struggle to tell the right story there. And then the other thing that I'd say is pretty common is people don't get as granular, like you hear within SaaS, or even some of the consumer models like CAC LTV or magic number kind of being some of the key metrics that folks track. And, generally folks track like CAC by channel, but they don't necessarily track LTV by channel, which is just kind of odd because like some customers behave totally differently depending on what kind of traffic or whatever is running across a channel. And so, in fact, I'd say the majority of companies we see kind of lump LTV together and then break out CAC by channel. And so I do think it's important to have another level of sophistication there, just to have a clearer picture of something like CAC LTV across the different channels, because it makes a business, or makes it better for a business earlier to know where they really want to focus and where they're finding their best customers.
Well, I like information because it gives me the ability to say, maybe I spent $500 getting this guy, but like LTV is out the roof. So it's totally acceptable to spend that much for him. We've got a whole nother group over here that's now $10 or, whatever your best in class, however low you want to get it. So I want to be able to come kind of with those numbers so that, and that's a big thing behind RevOptics, is getting granular and being able to shift focus when the market changes, or just say it's Christmas, and our buying habits change. So
and at a product level, because you can easily, in a customer size level, you can easily be fooled by CAC or retention numbers when you're looking at the macro, and not all these. You got to segment them down.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I find a lot of times, people will get into a spot where they're having trouble with churn. Obviously a SaaS business, huge part of the value of that business is the retention numbers there. And they'll get a couple years into it and they're like, hey, we really have this churn problem. And they'll look at like customer success or the product and like, hey, are we doing enough? And is the product, create enough value? Well, in my experience, over half of a retention number is based on the type of customer that you're attracting. So it's really on the front end. And so if you're not tracking that, early on, then you get into this spot where you want to improve churn. It's just like, you can't affect everything. You just got the wrong customers to begin with, and it's going to take you another year or two to replace those with, the right customers. And in between now and then, your metrics are going to suffer. And so I just can't emphasize enough how important it is to track some of those things early.
That's great. So let's do a polling question. So one of the recurring themes that we hear a lot at Vertify is that many organizations have siloed data, right? So marketing data lives in a marketing automation system. Sales-centric data lives in a CRM system. Your finance data is going to live in your billing and accounting systems. So my question to the audience is this: do you all have your sales, marketing, and finance data integrated to a single source of truth? So you can just answer yes or no. I'll give you a moment to answer.
And while they're answering, I do kind of want to ask the panelists, once again, as the person who's presenting this data, how do you feel about the data you're seeing if the marketing leader is in Marketo and then the sales leader comes on and jumps into a different system, and maybe customer success jumps into a different system? Like, does that break down a little bit of the trust when us as the company is reporting to you?
Yeah,
And I'll take that. Just, you gotta, where you are today, you gotta have one way to pull all this together. And we started off with CRM systems and map systems, and then then you add SalesLoft and outreach and things like that, and now customer success systems. And we're just talking about how customer success affects retention and how it affects it at the product level. Well, all those things tie together, and you have to tie together. So you have to have an analytics platform at the top of all that to pull it together, or you're going to be doing it in Excel spreadsheets. And if you're going to do it with a platform, you got to have a way to integrate that data.
All right. Dave, anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, at the end of the day, you just know that companies that have it integrated, that there's so much more efficiency and the decision-making is so much better. And it really gives you confidence there. So, I just know for a fact if, the marketing department, if you're a B2B SaaS business and marketing's job is to, drive the funnel for sales, ideally the decision-making and marketers can just see in their system and get real-time feedback as to whether or not what they're doing is being successful or not. If they have to run campaigns and then they have to have a meeting with head of sales or someone in sales once a week to find out if it's working or not, you're just not going to be as effective and efficient. And so, if people are pulling the data from two different systems, most likely you don't have that, you're not running optimally.
I have been there. I love the, little brother, big brother between sales and marketing.
Yeah.
So to shift gears then for a second, so I'll pose this question to you, Jim. So when considering a company to invest in, which KPIs are part of your due diligence process, and also how do you quantify risk?
At the top of those, at the beginning of it, we're looking for businesses that are high growth and management teams that are committed to kind of metric-driven growth. So we're looking and digging in and really trying to understand the sales and marketing funnels. Obviously, CAC to LTV, like we've talked about, all that matters. But to really understand somebody that has a conviction and a true understanding of their sales and marketing funnel, whether it's inbound, outbound, channel, as we mentioned earlier, by product, by customer type, that's just in their DNA. And that all sounds easy, but to tie all that together is not easy. But it's very doable with the systems and the integration that's available today. So we're looking for a team that understands their business, and that's the way they think about it. After that, on the kind of sales and marketing growth side, we're looking at the retention side, which is, and I'll say the same thing, just like you want sales and marketing systems and you want those tied together in a funnel, on the retention side, we want the same thing. We want somebody that is already thinking about, if not having deployed, some kind of customer success system. So to what Morgan mentioned earlier, you're integrated in, and I can tell who's using what elements of that product, and that's going to drive my ideal successful customer, my, sort of a maturity map of mature customer that's going to retain. And then you'll be able to tie that back to cohorts. So all that long-winded piece I just went through is, it's easy to say, but you have to have the data integrated back to some system to see that on a regular basis.
So, so along those lines, Jim, sometimes, one metric can overshadow another, and maybe it doesn't paint the most accurate picture of really what the health of the business is. So to keep things like customer growth rate from masking a churn problem, what in your estimation is the ideal way to report on retention rate versus churn?
Well, you want to look at retention rate, you want to look at it at a gross and a net level first. And then you want to look at it where it gets masked, is it gets masked by a company that grows really fast with small businesses early on, then they move up into enterprise. And those have totally different retention scenarios. Small and mid-sized businesses aren't going to retain at the same level that an enterprise retains. And also, as you're maturing your product, you're going to understand more about those elements that your customer uses, that you can say, if a customer will do these 5 things, I know they're going to retain at this rate versus the old rate. And to have your systems integrated those 5 things, so you see them daily and weekly. It can get masked if you don't segment by whatever's important to segment by. Product and customer size are usually the 2 biggest ones.
Yeah, I just one thing to add there that I see all the time is, that churn rate or retention rate, or however you want to look at it, gets masked also because within SaaS, usually it's like a year contract, or sometimes it's a multi-year contract. And so for companies that are growing quickly, like 75% of their revenue might be in the first year contract because they've just added it somewhat recently, right? And so if people have a contract, and they're locked in, they're not going to churn. And so you're looking at who is churning, but you're looking at it across the base of the entire customer set, which is obviously going to lower the number from kind of what will actually happen when the company matures. And so you can look at things like actual contract renewal rate. So like of what's up for renewal, what actually renews versus taking it against the whole ARR, MRR denominator. And I think that tells kind of a more accurate story of what the steady state kind of churn metric is for a business.
Do y'all feel like people are giving this information from the get-go, or do you feel like you're doing more coaching to make sure they're going down the path of this information that you want to see?
I think
Depends
people
on the
like
size of the company.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say entrepreneurs, they also want their business to look as attractive as possible, right? And so if they can present a lower churn number, taking a bigger denominator, like folks are going to do that. So you kind of have to piece out some of it sometimes to kind of get a true picture. Sorry, Jim, I didn't mean.
No, you said it. They're gonna come at it at a high level initially, but you got to quickly. You're totally impressed when I'm always impressed when somebody comes and says, "Here's my 3 types. Here's my total churn rate. Here's my 3 types of customers," and they already have started to understand how they're different. And then the best ones understand what they're doing in their product, that they can see it, that they're different on the fly. And that's, we didn't have customer success systems 5 years ago that at the scale we do now. You had an excuse. Now that's very doable. And if you're not doing it in these B2B SaaS businesses, you're kind of behind the 8 ball. And that's just one more data point to integrate back to our whole discussion here. We think of integration as sales and marketing. I'm going to argue customer success integration is equally important in the data sets that you need to really pull together to run and retain a successful base.
Yeah, and I'll add in that, like, ultimately, from a management and a company level, you want so much of the discussion to be about, all right, what are the decisions we're going to make based off of this data we have, or talk about, all right, what other data points do we want? And it's just amazing how much bandwidth can be sucked up by trying to gather the data at the executive level, or we guess or we think this might be right. And just the efficiency and the more quickly you can pivot and experiment when you get to sort of cherry pick and say, hey, let's get this data point and see what's happening. And like, even as just a simple example tying into churn, and it's at a high sophisticated level sometimes. Like we invest in companies very early on, and I often recommend to a lot of our companies early on to not push customers towards annual contracts, like, and push them towards monthly, because the reason why is one of the data points that you want is, are your customers happy and do they really like your product? And if they're on an annual contract, you don't really find out if someone's that unhappy and they're 5 months in. You find out 7 months later on this delay. But that's just an example of, an executive decision you can make that sort of brings another data point up that you wouldn't otherwise have. That's the same thing when you start looking at a sophisticated company that doesn't just gather the data by segment, but then also is doing it by cohort and can really just get this second and third level insight into what's going on. And sometimes you get situations where a top level number look alarming, but as you look in that second or third level, you're like, churn's up because we ran this marketing campaign and brought a lot of new customers in the segment, and that batch happened to be really high churn. So we're not going to target that one anymore, but we don't have to worry about anything across the health of the whole business. It's not reflective of that. But, unless you're gathering the data correctly, you just don't know that, and you can worry over something you shouldn't worry about.
Those are great points. So to shift gears, so Morgan, you recently did an interview with Crunchbase where you discussed what warnings you're giving to your portfolio companies, amidst the pandemic, which has just completely changed everything, right? So can you tell us how, those changes, what metrics are reporting on, or has it changed what metrics you want to see?
Yeah, and so I appreciate the question. So the nut of the message that I sent out to the portfolio, which was the basis of that interview, was basically when things started deteriorating in early March, we basically sent a note to all of our companies and said, hey, even if you're not seeing it yet in your business, you need to basically at least freeze new hiring. You need to come up with a more conservative financial plan for the year, and you need to start acting on that ASAP. And the experience there comes from, I've been doing VC now 17 years. So through 2008, 9, and then also as an operator, when the .com crash happened in 2000. And the regrets that most people have were, I did too little, too late. You don't hear a lot of people really lamenting the fact that they did a little bit too much too soon. I'm sure there are like a case or two out there of that, but generally it's the latter. And so we wanted to just get in the mind of, a lot of our young companies that it's better to react too early. And so, and then not that you have to necessarily stay on that plan, but you have to prove yourself off of it, right? So don't do anything for 2 or 3 months, continue to look at the metrics. And then if you, are getting a tailwind from this, or your business really truly is unaffected, then get back on your normal operating plan, but don't assume that, things aren't going to change for you. And so one of the things we focused on, specifically metrics wise, is some of the kind of leading indicators rather than obviously a lot of people are focused on sales and hey, did you hit Q1? And, how are things tracking from Q2? And that's all fine and well. And a lot of our companies ended up hitting Q1 because those deals were already super progressed and a lot of the business was already in for the quarter. But if you started looking at new pipeline generation, you saw pretty rapid deterioration, especially in companies that have more of an enterprise selling model, simply because no conferences, no in-person meetings. So the lead gen mix had to change and people were kind of discovering new channels that were effective. And so you really saw it there. And then in terms of how we get people, out of that more conservative plan and onto kind of more of a more traditional growth plan, it's just looking at those leading edge indicators, compared to what normal looks like and how close are we, and does it make sense to start moving off that, or should we remain hunkered down a little bit and more risk adverse?
Yeah, and another way I love what Morgan just said, and at a really high level, it's sort of all of a sudden overnight, burn rate, cash and bank, and effectively runway become really important data points that maybe weren't so important a month earlier, right? And you can't just assume that, all right, well, my spreadsheet going forward shows I'm going to have this burn because I'm going to have this revenue growth. What would your burn and runway look like if you were flat or a little negative? And these were just, we see it across our portfolio company at the earlier stages, particularly, some companies on the finance side, their numbers roll up quickly and instantly. They report the first day after the end of the month, they're sending up all their full financials, burn and everything. In some companies, it's 3 weeks later. Well, when a big shock to the system happens like this, the ones that roll it up quickly are the ones that, are acting the fastest. And to what Morgan just said, acting 3 or 4 weeks earlier than you otherwise would have can make a huge difference.
So, so Dave, your LinkedIn profile talks about how at Rightside Capital, you're looking to add more transparency and efficiency into a highly fragmented, inefficient market. Can you discuss how data and analytics plays into that?
Yeah, so we're basically sort of a quantitative data-driven approach to this really early sort of pre-VC stage investing. So we're investing in companies that are raising like, sub $500,000 total round sizes. And we're very transparent on our website, sort of the general profile of company that we're looking for. And we give very quick yes or no's to companies, usually in less than a week. And the way we're able to do that is we're basically gathering up real world data from these companies. And, and some of it's, most of it's provided by the company and that we get in conversations or through our forums. But it's amazing the variance you see across companies at an early stage. When we say, okay, this is great, we're going to make a decision on you, or now suddenly send me over all the evidence to support the data points you've told me. Like, send me your list of customers and the MRR amounts. Send me your full pipeline report. Send me your financials. Some companies, it's like, certainly will do. And I get an email, 40 minutes later with all of that. And some companies, it's 4 days later, or it's some of it a couple days later and some of it a couple days after that, because there is no system and they're having to go pull it all manually. And, it's not that unusual when you have companies that are, very early and just have, small amounts of revenue. But even just there, it's amazing when you're dealing with someone who's really important, a potential external funder, how powerful it is when you've got all that data that can be pulled from systems, or hopefully a common system.
Yeah, so I noticed that your firm's philosophy is to take an evidence-based approach to seed staging, startup investing. So any additional color or context you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we basically live and die by sort of the data profiles in our company. So we try and eliminate sort of all gut feel from our decision-making process. So, I've lived my life in tech, started a software company, started a hardware company, been an investor for ages. And, I feel like my gut feel should have a large impact and should be able to predict the future very well. But we think most of the evidence shows that's not the case. And, it allows us to invest in things that we otherwise maybe wouldn't invest in or look crazy, but there's compelling data to show there's a there there. So at the end of the day, data is sort of our guiding light that we go by.
So just before we went live today, you and I were discussing the Malcolm Gladwell book, Blink. And I think we all agreed that, our guts have been wrong before. So we're best to just let's just rely on the data.
Yeah, I think Blink's an accurate, when you're living in a world where there's otherwise no data, I think that gut feel expert opinion is probably better than most other things. But I think data always trumps that.
Yeah, agreed. So Lacey, you had mentioned the book to me, Lean Analytics, where they discuss data informed versus data driven. So what's your opinion on one versus the other?
I know it's interesting. I feel like my answer to this may be changing as we're talking. I mean, in the book, they even say data informed is the lazy man's way of thinking about things, but we have to understand that if you just look at data and you're not stepping back and looking at the overall picture, that can be pretty dangerous as well. And so there's probably a lot that I want to take away from this in regards to how we balance that gut feeling, because, once again, back to kind of some statistics, they say only 21% of companies are able to fully measure marketing's contribution to revenue. And we are talking that first person in the door down to like that revenue dollar. So we're expecting people to make data-driven decisions, but not all those people have the right data in place. So the data informed has to come in, and I always challenge my team to think in outcomes. And so from my perspective, I really have to balance those two things. And I kind of maybe want to then turn this into a question on how do I balance those? You know, how do I bring some of the gut instinct, some of the data informed decision making into the conversations with you guys who are very, very data driven? Because especially on the marketing side, we have to make some gut decisions every now and then. So what do y'all think about it when you do maybe see some of those instincts coming in on board meetings?
Well, I can jump in here. And I think one of the challenges, especially in the startup world in general, is you're living in a world of just massive uncertainty. Like your business model generally isn't proven out that well. You've got all these variables that are these huge unknowns. And a lot of people, you know, think that's an environment where just a lot of gut feeling should come into play. And what I would say is, like, experimenting and gut feel don't have to be totally intertwined. Like, so much of it is having the ability to collect data and saying, all right, let's run lots of experiments, but let's define in advance what we define as success or not. And let's run these tests and then measure them and see what the results are. So often we see companies or we see people who are using data to sort of gather up information after the fact, and then subconsciously they're trying to use the data to sort of prove that something they did was a success, or maybe prove that it wasn't if they didn't want it to be. And it's the importance of sort of defining in advance what success is. And that allows you to have just operate in a very uncertain environment and do a lot of experimenting and sort of bring gut just feel into play if you want to come up with some experiments, but measure the success using data.
Because I think
Really great points. Yeah, go ahead, Lacey.
Oh, sorry, a little bit of a peek behind the curtain. When I talk about the metrics or the data just from this panel, like, it's a success. My CEO's excited, you know, our VP of marketing's excited, the whole team's excited. But I can't walk in there and also say, we can like replicate this exactly and we'll get the same amount of success. So I definitely have to always go at it from, this is the dollar amount we put in, this is what we got out, like, here's your ROI on this. I don't know that I can do the exact same thing again. Now I have a feeling that if I tweak this and I do maybe some different ways of advertising and marketing, that I can even get a greater result. So I think there's also, not that we're not going to celebrate this, but there's also that time to be like, okay, how do we make it even better? Like, beyond the data points that define success today.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that is this, is that today, so little marketing is linear, it's multi-touch, right? There are so many touch points that ensue throughout the buyer's journey that trying to assign really what led a prospect ultimately become a customer is rather muddled. And so that the only thing you can do then is you have to measure individual tactics within just to, to gauge things on a micro level, but ultimately trying to weight them accordingly to determine how they ultimately advance the prospect through the funnel. So it's become a lot more scientific these days, but I think at the same point, when you do it correctly, you'll be able to start to see more predictive intelligence on where to best focus your efforts on.
And I know we're probably getting close to the Q&A part of this, so I want to say, as a data-driven marketer, and once again at this director level, where I'm kind of coming up from being the person who, like, you need to prove out what that blog post did, to knowing that I have to report to a board who doesn't care how many page views something got. I geek out on the fact that we're connecting Salesforce, Marketo, Outreach, we're talking about Zoom, we're talking about Pendo, going back to the customer success role. Like, I cannot wait to have all that information housed and start seeing this customer journey all the way through to the end, how everything is being affected, how people are growing, when they're renewing, all the different data points. This is why Verify is so exciting to me, because I don't want to be in the 92% that doesn't have access to the numbers finance is looking at and the numbers sales is looking at. I want to see all of that, and let's include customer success in that too. So it's been interesting. It's fun to integrate all these things, and then maybe a little analysis paralysis, but from what you guys have talked about and the KPIs that you want to see, that helps it helps us hone in our craft and what we're really reporting to all of y'all.
Yeah, it really comes back to, just to wrap that up, it really comes back to every good customer has a maturity model, and they start off as a lead somewhere, and they end up in your customer success system using all your functionality and being the greatest customer you ever had, right? So how do you, unfortunately, that's going to touch three or four or more systems along the way. So you have to have that customer maturity model integrated so that you can see the data and go back and find other customers like that, and make the ones that aren't like that you have act like that. And that's the vision everybody's got to keep in their head.
So
I think I was going to say, a last thing to sort of point out is that, Vertify is really deep into data. A lot of its clients are, a lot of the people on this webinar are. But if we step back and look at sort of the world as a whole right now, most large companies, most of your competitors probably don't use data that well at all. I mean, I'm on calls with our portfolio companies all the time, talking to huge enterprises, and I'm always shocked at how little data they have about almost anything that's going on. And so the competitive advantage you can have, particularly over some of your larger competitors, is just enormous. When you have really good data systems and you're making data-driven decisions and you're able to experiment and pivot and change things much more quickly, it's just enormous. And I think people underestimate how much of an edge you have because people don't realize how behind so much of the world is still.
So before we transition to Q&A, Morgan, any final thoughts? Oh, I think you're on mute, Morgan.
You're on mute, Morgan.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, guys. Yeah, the only thing I would add with respect to kind of, metrics, and are those kind of the end all be all of everything, or, is there a place for gut feel and something more, is, I certainly think, there's metrics are critically important, but there is room for more. And I think, certainly with the gut feel, like where you throw the first dart, in terms of, where you kind of align the product market vision of the company, sometimes that isn't like a linear transition, right? Like a lot of times people think with data, it's like, oh, we're going to learn, X, Y, or Z, and we're going to, make this button red and this button blue, and that increases conversion, or we're going to move this around up here and that increases conversion. And all those things are true. And for mature businesses, they can be hugely incremental in terms of revenue contribution, all that kind of thing. But you didn't get the iPhone from like an incremental improvement over like a pager or a BlackBerry, right? Like somebody had to kind of throw a completely new dart in a totally different direction. Because I think if you take the linear progression, it's just like, oh, well, if, we had a bigger screen, or, we had a key for every letter instead of the, ABC all being on the number one, it would make people easier to type. And you kind of go through this linear model, which is a lot of what more mature companies do. You get improvement, but you don't get kind of transitional movement in a market. And so there is a place to sit there and say, hey, I do have a gut feel about what the market needs here. It's informed by data, but it isn't kind of a linear transgression from kind of what other people are doing. But sure as hell, when I throw that first stone and I take that gut feel innovative step, you got to then measure and adapt and, be realistic about the success or failure of that. And so I think that's that basic practice of not being afraid to take a stab at something, but then kind of routinely and maniacally measuring it after you take that first stab to either throw it out or improve it is important.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and conclude. I can't thank you all enough. These have been some great insights. I thought we had a great conversation today. Have a great afternoon, everybody.